Today I'm speaking with Bruce Gerenser. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I'm so excited to hear your story because I've actually been listening to it in other podcasts that you've done. You've obviously been very vocal about your story, and we really appreciate your sharing it. And I'm so honored that you're going to share it here today with my platform as well. But you have some very interesting aspects to your story that are kind of different from what I usually hear in interviews. So I've said that a few times, but yours is definitely unique. But I'm going to give a brief bio for Bruce, and then we'll jump in. Bruce is 64, is that correct?
Yes.
And you live in rural Northwest Ohio with your wife of 43 years. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And he and his wife, Polly, have 6 grown children and 13 grandchildren. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this is jumping a little bit ahead to your story, but just to give part of the bio, you pastored 5 different independent fundamental Baptist churches for 25 years in Ohio, Texas, and Michigan, preaching over 4,000 sermons. Is that correct?
Yes. And not all the churches I pastored were independent Baptist churches. I also pastored a Southern Baptist church, a Christian Union church, and a non-denominational church for 7 years. So, yes.
Okay, wow. I live here just north of Atlanta. I'm about 5 minutes away from the North American Mission Board. If you know that group.
Okay. Yes, I do. Yes.
So, well, before we get into your story, is there anything else you could tell us about yourself? Any hobbies or interests?
Well, one hobby, I guess, that people are surprised that I have. Well, actually, 2. One, I like dirt track racing. Our family is not the typical redneck hillbilly go to the dirt track race family, but years ago when I was in the ministry, it was a cheap form of entertainment. The kids would get in free, and so on like Friday or Saturday nights we would go to the local dirt tracks. And second, I collect Lionel trains. And so that's a hobby I had when I was a youth, and then I got away from it. And here, since I've retired, I've picked back up on that again. So,
when you say collect,
yes.
You mean like collect them and keep them in the boxes, or like actually run them?
Yeah, made to run. Yes, yeah, made to run. Yeah, I hope to involve my grandchildren with some of what I'm doing, and so that's the goal. That's the goal.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm from Lancaster County, if you know that area of Pennsylvania, or
Yes.
I should say I'm more from Philadelphia, but my family moved out there. And there's an area there called Strasburg Railroad, and there's a whole bunch of little places like that do it takes you an hour to walk through the little train things that they've set up that make it look like a real little town. It's cool stuff. It's a lot of work too, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm very much a train fan.
That's awesome. For wrapping up the bio, I have one more question that's just pop into my mind, and I got to ask it. You probably had this before. Do you ever play Santa Claus in the mall at Christmas?
No, I don't. I actually talked about it until I have some serious health problems, which kind of put an end to that. And but yeah, Polly had gotten the pattern, and we talked about getting the material and making I get a lot of funny looks, and just the last week we were in the grocery store, and this little girl, it was the look. I can see it. She's got her eyes fixed on me as I'm walking down the aisle, and she wouldn't take her eyes off me the whole time. And so I stopped and I said, so you think I'm Santa Claus, don't you? And she nodded her head. And I talked with her a little bit, and her mom. And so that happens, particularly between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I'll get a lot of that. And sometimes I'll wear a Santa hat and kind of play that up. So, so I have the build, the complexion, the beard, but not the hair.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I worked in the mall for a while in an evening job for a couple of years, and it was cool at the holidays to see all the Santas coming in. Well, I definitely wanted to give you time to share your story. I know there's a lot of details, and I've got some questions for you from the other podcasts I've listened to. But okay. I'd love to give you the floor to just tell us as early as you can what your journey was like.
Sure. I typically trace my story back to 1962. My dad we lived in rural Northwest Ohio here, and my dad packed us up and we moved all the way to San Diego, California. And, Dad was looking for the proverbial pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and he didn't find it. He was a truck driver in Ohio, and he ended up being a truck driver in California. But while we were in San Diego, my parents started attending Scott Memorial Baptist Church in El Cajon, and it was pastored at the time by Tim LaHaye, gentleman that was the writer of the Left Behind books and Act of Marriage, the Evangelical Sex Manual, and
his wife eventually became the head of the Concerned Women for America. Is that right?
Yeah, Beverly LaHaye. And so it was there that my parents, who were Lutheran, made a profession of faith and became born again Christians. And so from that point forward, we were independent Baptists, and it wasn't only the religious aspect of it, but my parents also got involved with the John Birch Society. And
I'm not familiar with that group. What do they believe?
Yeah, well, they were a pro-American, pro-Constitution group, definitely rabid right-wing, supporters of Barry Goldwater in the 1960s. And, and so my mom in particular got deeply involved in that kind of thinking and stayed on that track, most of her adult life. And so, and after about 3 years, we moved back to Ohio. And from that time forward, we started, we attended independent, Baptist churches. And, we were the family, every time the doors were open, we were at church. And then, as a kid, my dad moved us around a lot. And I attended numerous schools as a child, lived in more houses than I can count. And I'll have people ask me, so did your dad get transferred? Was he in the military? And I said, no, Dad just didn't pay the bills. And so we had to move a lot. I mean, that was, that's just the way it was.
What was it like as a kid doing that? I mean, I imagine that, like, making friends and then suddenly having to kind of lose them, especially in the age where, I had no cell phones and email.
Yes.
Assume that was very uprooting to you.
Yes, very difficult. And taken with a lot of the other experiences that I had, in my life as a child, which, if you want, we can talk about those later. But, I know in talking with my counselor, the sheer weight of the trauma that I've had, and then it was trauma moving from place to place. And, I had times where I went to 3 different schools in 1 year. And so it was difficult to make friends. My only saving grace was that I played basketball, I played baseball, and so that helped somewhat. But what gave me stability as a kid was, of course, the church. I would, make friends in the church. And particularly, we moved around. And then when I was the start of 8th grade, we moved to Findlay, Ohio, and started attending Trinity Baptist Church. It was a rather large church, over 1,000 members. And, it was there that at the age of 15 that I made a, public profession of faith, got saved, born again, all the various terms that evangelicals use for the experience, and was baptized. And then a couple weeks later, I went forward again and told the church that I believed that God was calling me to preach. And in a couple weeks after that, I preached my first sermon at age 15. So, from that point forward, I was a true believer. Go ahead.
Was there a time before that, like when you were a child, when you placed your faith in Christ, even if it was in a seed form? Like, what was the
Yeah,
first time you actually prayed the sinner's prayer, so to speak?
age 5 in California. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My wife had the same experience around 5 or 6. And then it wasn't until she was in her teens that she, in the Baptist church, we called it rededicated our life. In my case, it was in a revival meeting, and I thought that I was lost and, needed to be saved. And,
Mm.
and it was a very emotional experience for me at that moment.
Yeah,
And
mine was very
certainly,
similar. The whole age 5 and then recommitting it in young teenage years. Yeah.
yeah, it seems to be a common experience with evangelicals. Uh, but for me, from that point forward, I was a true believer. I talked to some of my friends during that period, and you know, um, they had very different life experiences than I did. Yes, they went to church, but Bruce was the kid that really believed this stuff. And
Mm.
my wife and I, we were virgins when we got married, for example. And, and I remember talking to one of my friends about it, and she kind of laughed and, well, you were probably the only one in the youth group not having sex. And,
Mm.
so, but they said the pastors taught us, you wait till marriage, I believe the Bible, and, you know, uh, played by the rules.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much, from that point, moved around again some more, and out to Arizona and back twice, and finally returned to my mom's home in Northwest Ohio here, not too far from my home now. And then at the age of 19, I went to college, and I attended Midwestern Baptist College in Pontiac, Michigan. It was a small independent fundamentalist Baptist college, about 400 students when my wife and I were there. And there I began my training for the ministry. And of course, that's where I met Polly,
Can I
and
ask? I do want to ask you some questions about college, but can I take us back a little bit?
sure.
We've mentioned the word or denomination Baptist a few times, and independent and fundamental Baptist. But for anyone that's listening that maybe is from a very different denominational background, or is just maybe not even religious at all, what does it mean? What did it mean to you when you were in it? Like, what are their core beliefs? And not, I should say, maybe ask it in two ways. What is what is like the core basics of Christianity to you as far as you understood it when you were in it? And then what are the distinctives of being a Baptist within Christendom?
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's a good question, Tim. So, IFB, it basically is, the churches are independent. They're autonomous. There's no denomination. Every church is independently operated, though in truth, uh, these churches do congregate together according to what colleges they may have attended, or there were certain fellowships groups that they were a part of, like the Southwide Baptist Fellowship or the Baptist Bible Fellowship and different things. And
Hmm.
so every church is independent. And then, they're fundamentalist. And now that word had a lot of different meanings depending on where you were, but the core um, uh, thinking about that term was that the fact that you were separated from the world, and so there were things that you did and didn't do according to the teachings of the Bible, and you also were separated from other Christians who were not of your persuasion. And they are independent Baptists are fiercely separatist. They're Some will argue that they're countercultural, but I say they're anti-cultural. And so uh, and then within that framework of this autonomous churches, this separatist view of the world, then you have pretty much standard fare Baptist doctrine, the virgin birth, the deity of Christ, the resurrection of Christ from the dead, the necessity of the new birth, and the second coming of Jesus Christ. Most independent fundamentalist Baptists are premillennial and pre-tribulational, and a lot of them are dispensationalists on top of that. And so there was, there's not much difference between an IFB church's doctrinal beliefs and, say, just a generic Pentecostal church, as far as the core doctrines were concerned.
They would, can I ask you to clarify, they would separate from quite a few Christians doctrinally on Arminianism. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that was my next point. In the 1980s, Calvinism started having a big influence on IFB churches. In fact, I embraced Calvinism myself, and in the late 1980s. And so most IFB pastors are what I call one-point Calvinists. They believe that once you're saved, you're always saved. And then, there were those of a Calvinistic persuasion, that were followed in the teachings of like John MacArthur and people like that.
R.C. Sproul.
Yes. And
were you a 5-pointer at the end?
At the very end, no. I was. How would I describe myself at the very end? I would describe myself as a moderately liberal Mennonite who believed that salvation was works, depended on works, I guess would be where I at the very end. Yeah. But for the most part, from the late 80s to the early 2000s, I was a standard fare, 5-point Calvinist, and lost a lot of friends over that, that were either you in the IFB, either love or you hate Calvinism. And there were plenty of preachers that hated Calvinism. And so, and that's, there are little other doctrinal peculiarities, as far as the, back to separation from the world, for example, there's the various social codes, or church standards is what they were usually called. And so there were, I grew up in churches, in pastor churches, where women didn't wear pants, and we didn't drink alcohol, we didn't go to movies, and and premarital sex was a sin, and watching R-rated movies or even PG-13 movies on TV were a sin. And the sin list was endless. And Tim, I heard sermons on, I heard one guy preach, he said that wire rim glasses and having mustaches were sins. And his whole he was some old codger. And his whole thinking about that was, well, in the 60s and the 70s, men had facial hair and they wore wire rim glasses, and that was a sign of the world. It was a sign of rebellion against God. And, and so in a lot of IFB churches, that's kind of moderated some, they're about 20 years behind. And, but there's still a lot of churches that they're sticking to the same social beliefs that they had, 20, 30 years ago.
And a lot of it's like just appearances, like you said, like whatever looks like it's worldly today. So it might be different in a generation or two, but today, if that's what it looks like to not look like a solid Christian, then you need to, obviously make sure you're not in that group and that you look distinct. I was going to just mention one quick anecdote that you might laugh at too, with the whole rule book thing. When I was at Bob Jones, I went to Bob Jones for just my freshman year. I did finish up at a more liberal Christian.
That was enough to cure you.
Yeah. Well, it was as a long story why I left, but I did go to a more liberal Christian college. In the big picture was still very, very conservative, but compared to Bob Jones, everyone's liberal, except for
Yes.
maybe Pensacola. But
Yes.
when I was there, one of the rules was you don't do interracial dating at all.
Yes.
And it was really interesting, but I heard this was after I left, but that rule had been in the books for forever. Everything from probably when they first were doing the whole curse of Ham thing to it's just, we're just not going to do it. It's a cultural thing, but we're going to keep it separate. And after I left, one of the George Bushes were invited. Well, he was on I forget which one, but he was on the campaign trail, and he was invited to speak at the big amphitheater there, and he did. And as soon as he left, of course, someone did some digging and said, "Oh, he just spoke at this school where you can't do interracial dating." And it created this huge hubbub because everyone wanted to be very Republican and very conservative with George Bush. And now George Bush was distancing himself from all these good Christians, so to speak, at Bob Jones. So after, generations of this rule being on the books, because of this one issue, suddenly it's gone. You can now do interracial dating just like that.
Right.
And
Right.
I never got
Yep.
over how, if it's that important to God, then how can it just change over one little issue like that? It blew my mind when I heard it.
Yeah, I remember this was in the early 80s, I think, and we're at Polly's mom and dad's for dinner, and they had invited over this couple from their church, and he was a senior vice president with a major bank in Columbus, and he was explaining why he sent his kids to Bob Jones, and he had no problem saying, "Yeah, there's no black people there." And I just, I stood up and I says, "You're nothing but a racist," and of course that caused a huge problem at the dinner table. But look, in retrospect, I certainly had racist tendencies myself, if I'm honest, and but this whole thing of different races not being able to marry was just silly. But yeah. And I noticed like with you talking about Bob Jones, I saw a picture of they have it's a bluegrass group that sings for the college, and they were all wearing, all the women were wearing jeans, and I thought, really, when did that happen?
That would have been
Because
anathema
that
years
definitely
ago.
wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
But you're right, there's this evolution, and sometimes even with my my mother-in-law's church is staunchly fundamentalist. Their kids go to Pensacola Bob Jones or Crown College of the Bible, or Lancaster Baptist College out in California. But even there, I've noticed little changes. Used to in the early 80s, you had to sign if you were going to work in the church, teach Sunday school in any official capacity, you had to sign this paper that you agreed to these various things. And one of the things was that men couldn't have long hair and no facial hair whatsoever, none. And I notice now that their pastor has facial hair, and I thought, wow, liberal,
The slippery slope.
Yes.
I heard so many sermons going up about that slippery slope. Just don't even go near it.
Yes.
Oh, and there are all these good colleges going down the slope. Oh man, that's crazy. Well, I did want to ask too, just going back to you a little bit. When you were younger, I know there's a lot more we're going to get into with your time in college and your time as a pastor, but could you just tell us more about what it was like for you experientially? Like, did you feel like when you prayed that you felt like God was listening? Did it feel close? And was it like a vibrant relationship kind of thing looking back, or how do you remember it?
No, I really believed that God heard my prayers, and that I could feel, God's presence in my life. And I've been in church services and preached in services where the Holy Spirit's presence was palatable, and I mean, you could feel his presence. And so, yes, I had very deep experiences with God. And I, one of my favorite times as a pastor, one church I pastored for 11 years, the church was way out in the middle of the country. And sometimes I'd sit in the auditorium by myself and the lights are off, and, and I just would commune with God. Of course, now, I understand those things from a sociological and psychological, I was conditioned to feel those things. And I think I can adequately explain, those experiences now. But yeah, certainly, yeah, Jesus and was very real to me. So I always laugh when people, common criticism is that, I never was a real Christian, and I just, well, if I wasn't a real Christian, nobody was. And that's how I look at it, because I was a true blue believer. And
yeah,
now my
it's
wife,
amazing.
yeah,
I was saying, it's
my
amazing
wife,
that when you get that response, it blows your mind that people would say that
yes,
about you.
yeah. Now Polly would give a different answer to that question. When she would tell you that she never felt God's presence like that. She spent most of her life wondering, why can't I have these experiences like other people have? Why don't I feel these things like other people feel?
Like the whole palatable closeness, like
Yeah,
God's
yeah,
there
that,
and
yes,
working.
And so, like I said, her experiences in the church are very, very different from mine. And
Can I ask about that when she was in that frame? I know she's in a different frame of mind now with the whole topic, but when she was in it, do you know if she felt like she was always at fault, like that was her fault? Because there's often that whole preachment that you're as close to God as you want to be, because
yes,
he's if you're running from him, that if your preach is hard, all you have to do is turn around. You might feel 1,000 miles away from God, but he's kind of like the prodigal son's father. He's right there waiting for you, and you turn your face around. He's not 1,000 miles away. He's right there. And so if you're not close to God, it's because you're doing something wrong. Do you know if she felt like she was guilty or harboring
yeah,
sin?
we've actually talked about that, that she felt that there was something wrong with her. Why can't I feel God's presence like other people can? And quite honestly, as her husband, I made it worse for her, because I would look, I was paid to study the Bible and pray, and I had hours every day to do those things. And here's my poor wife with 6 kids, and 3 of them were in diapers at one time, and and her husband's getting on her about not reading the Bible enough and not praying enough. And I look back on that and I say, how awful that was. This poor woman, it was just enough for her to get up and try to, because I got up and I walked out the door, and I didn't come back for 10 or 12 hours later. And it was up to her to manage the house and the children and whatnot. And it was an unfair pressure put on her to perform, and she just didn't have the time, the strength, or the energy to do those things. And so,
If she figured if she maybe wasn't one of the true children of God?
There were times she had doubts. Yeah, absolutely. And we went through a period of time, in the late 2000s, before we deconverted. There was, we were trying to find a church to attend, and we were looking for some place where Christianity really mattered. And we were in kind of a seeker mode, I guess would be the best way to describe that. And Polly, she would tell me, why is it that God is nowhere to be found? maybe she's the one that, quite frankly, was the person to have the first doubts about all of this. We probably ought to talk about that, because I remember those conversations. We would listen to music by a group, for example, called Everybody Duck, and they did praise and worship music, and there were some songs that caused deep emotional experiences for both of us. But for Polly, it was she desperately wanted God's presence in her life, but it seemed to elude her no matter what she did. And of course, I'm sure critics will say, well, that was her fault. Like you said, if God was always there, so it was her fault. And I would reject that, out of hand.
Yeah, it's quite a mind job that we as Christians put on ourselves and on other people for situations like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Can I ask, going back to your experience? I have quite a few questions here. I'll try to get through them quickly before we get back to your college story. But when you were experiencing God and felt close to him, did you ever, number one, did you ever feel like you actually heard his voice, either audibly or just in some way that you sense he was actually kind of, nudging you maybe emotionally and mentally, like saying, I'm actually speaking to you in some way? And kind of related, did you ever see anything that you would have classified as a absolutely true miracle, either in your life or in someone else's?
No, not as far as audibly hearing the voice of God. I can say that in 1994, this pastor in this church in Texas had called and wanted me to become their co-pastor, and I turned them down. And I just felt my work wasn't done, where I was. And and a few weeks later, I'm sitting in my study one night, and all of a sudden I had this very deep emotional experience, and I started thinking about, making that move to Texas, and going to a new church, and I started crying, and I felt that God was in the room there with me, and I felt that he was telling me that, yes, he wanted me to go ahead and take that church. And now I thought the same a few weeks before that God was telling me, no, he didn't want me to do that. In retrospect, as I look at that, what was really going on is that, I was kind of at the end of my rope at the church I was at. It was a new opportunity for me at a much larger church, much better pay, new experience. I am naturally a wanderlust. I'm restless. There's a reason I started churches, that entrepreneurial spirit, and so it was a new opportunity. And so, yeah, that's kind of really what was behind all that. But at the time, I called it God.
Yeah.
And then I realized that the only God in the story was Bruce.
Yeah. Isn't that such a weird, when you realize like you're literally been talking to yourself this whole time? It's so weird.
Yes.
A quick anecdote on my side for the whole listening to God thing. When I was finishing up my time at Bible college, and my degree was to be a pastor, I had to do an internship as part of the requirements for the degree. And so I did at my home church there near Philadelphia. And I spent a lot of time, of course, with the main pastor, but I also spent a lot of time with the elders. And this one elder, I really respected him at the time. Seemed like a great man. He was the head of a missions organization. And this one night, after a prayer meeting or church or something, it was in the evening. But he had keys to the church, and I think I did too. And so we got some chairs and we sat in the foyer, and we just talked. It was just like a man-to-man talk about God, talk about ministry. And he asked me this question at some point in the conversation, because I thought it was going so well. We're bonding over the things of the Lord. And he says, so tell me, what is the Lord telling you specifically these days? And I said, well, like, I know that he speaks to us through his word, but he's
Right.
saying the whole same thing to us all through his word. And he said, no, no, no. I mean, what is God specifically saying to you that he's not saying to everyone else? What is he saying to you? And I sat there and I tried to like understand, maybe I misunderstood the question, is like rephrasing it. And it's like, no, no, what is God actually saying to you specifically? And I could almost feel like I was being tested. Like, you want to be a pastor, so you better hear God's voice.
Yeah.
And I admitted, I said, I've never heard God speak to me specifically. I read his word, I love it, but I've never heard him speak to me specifically. And his jaw just dropped, and I felt like I had been judged so bad. Like, I guess I shouldn't be in ministry. I don't hear his voice. But it's crazy, the stuff we go through.
Well, yeah, and of course that's a common, you know, there's an expectation that a pastor has some kind of inside track with God, and
Yes.
that God's whispering in your ear. And certainly, for me, I believed in, my sermons, for example, that I believe that God told me what to preach, and typically I'd be studying the Bible, and God would impress upon me, to preach on this passage or maybe on this book of the Bible, and I really believe that. And of course, again, it's in hindsight, it's what Bruce wanted to preach on, and so yeah.
It's kind of like a deeper version of that whole thing of like, what does God want to say to you today? Well, just open up your Bible and he'll give you the Psalm. It always opens the middle of the Bible, so you get to the Psalms.
Yes.
But
Yes.
and that specific Psalm is the one he's speaking to you today.
Yes.
He made you open up to Psalm 45 or whatever.
Yeah.
Well,
It's almost, it's like divination or magic, some of that, if you think about it a little bit. And I heard guys that said they didn't know what to preach on, and they just turned to open their Bible and pointed to a verse, and that's what they preached on that day. And I didn't have that much faith. So.
Yeah. Well, just a few more quick questions about your earlier beliefs, and then we'll go back to your college. I wanted to ask about the angels and demons in the spirit world. What did you feel like was happening behind the scenes? Did you, the whole idea of like in the book of Daniel, where, the angel wants to, come to help Daniel, but, he was prevented by the spirit of, the regional spirit, the demon that was in the area. And obviously, there's, stories where the demons are there to tempt us, to hurt us even. And then you mentioned Left Behind, that makes me think of a similar book that came out at a similar time, I believe, This Present Darkness.
Frank Peretti's book. Yeah, I read those. Yeah.
What was your whole worldview and perspective on the unseen realm?
I believe that it existed, that there was a spiritual realm, and that, I didn't take it as far as, Peretti did in his books, that, that angels and demons are fighting day and night, but I did believe that, the Bible told us that we had guardian angels that cared for us and protected us, and certainly I that spiritual entities were actively involved in the world that we lived in, and certainly much more so with demonic influence, satanic influence, more so than angels. Saying something was demonic was an easy way to explain, evil or sin, certain behaviors in the world. And so, but yeah, now I certainly didn't go as far as, in charismatic churches where they, they see angels and demons under every bed. And, it just, I'd like to think that at the time I had somewhat of a biblical basis, for my beliefs about those things. And so yeah, I certainly believe that there was a spiritual realm.
Gotcha. Another question: with being from the independent fundamental Baptist group, I'm confident that one of the biggest pieces of their preachment and what was a passion for them is soul winning, getting the word out there. Did you feel guilty at all if you ever didn't? Like, just give an example or two. If you're sitting there watching football and you think to yourself, I could be walking around this neighborhood hoping to bump into somebody and give them at least a tract, give them a chick tract or something. But I'm sitting here watching football instead. There's no chance for me to share the gospel. Or if you're even just literally near someone, like you say, you're standing in line, checking out, do your groceries, and someone's right in front of you. And did you feel like if you ever chose to not say something or give a tract or in some way connect them to them, that you were in some way guilty? Is that whole expression of their blood is on you? Or how did you deal with it, with the balance of soul winning and when you chose not to?
Yeah, well, I certainly lived with a lot of guilt over those things. Now I was a workaholic, so I rarely took time off. I had probably been in the ministry for 8-10 years before we ever took a vacation for the first time, and that's only because a pastor friend of mine paid for it, and invited me to preach in his church in Massachusetts, while I was there. And so I for a lot of years, for 20 years, we didn't have a television, and the only entertainment, we did two things. We went to the dirt track races, I mentioned at the start, and then we would take day trips. We'd pile all the kids in the car and we'd drive to Kentucky or West Virginia or maybe Maryland, and when we lived in Southeast Ohio, and look at the sights and see new things. But for the rest of the time, my life was very much immersed in the ministry. And if I'm asked a question, do I feel that I was a good soul winner? The answer would be no. I knocked on doors, I handed out tracts. For a number of years, I preached on the street, and I wasn't afraid to share my faith. But I'm not sure that I was really good at it as compared to other people. That I know when we would go knock on doors, and we knocked on thousands of doors over the years, and I always had a hard time pushing beyond the, hey, my name is Bruce Garenser, I pastor such and such church. We'd like to invite you to church this Sunday, and now I would do the shtick, hey, before I go, can I ask you a question? If you die today, do you know you go to heaven? And but I was never comfortable doing that. And so that led to guilt, and where I was more comfortable as far as soul winning was, of course, was, within the confines of the church. Now, I pastored one church in Southeast Ohio for 11 years. And, we had all told right around 600 conversions in that church over that 11-year period. It was a rural church, but we had aggressive ministries, bus ministry, for example. We ran 4 church buses, and and so there was, through my preaching, there were a lot of people that were converted. And so I was comfortable with that, less comfortable with the, I don't know what you were taught at Bob Jones, but certainly the evangelistic methods that I was taught at Midwestern. We had to take evangelism every semester. And so we were taught all these little methods that we would use to win people to Christ. And the college, for example, every year they would have a soul winning contest. and it was a contest. And and there'd be some preacher boys, they'd go out and they'd win hundreds of people to Jesus, and I never did well in those contests. Try as I might, it just was not. It was not in it. I was just wasn't. And
contest is a good word, though. It's a good choice of word. It's often what it felt like.
Yes, exactly right. Yes.
And even when it wasn't like a contest, you'd often get that general sense where they would want to give numbers a lot. They would say, "Oh, it was 125 people last week gave their soul to Christ," and the bigger the number, the more successful you were, and the more hopefully people would pass that plate and make it heavier. But we used to do that with at Bob Jones. We'd go down to Clemson University, and I'm not sure if it's down or over or whatever, but we go to Clemson University a couple times a month and try to do soul winning there on that college campus. And yeah, I cringe. Do you feel bad about what you did? I sure do. Do you feel guilty?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there were some people that certainly made professions of faith on their doorsteps, and I look on it now and I think, they were probably just trying to save themselves from me, get away from me. And so they would pray the prayer, and never got them to come to church or whatnot, but they were a number in the book. And certainly the IFB church movement is hyper aggressive as far as soul winning is concerned. Yeah. And that started even when I was in college. We had to fill out a form every week that there were a minimum number of people that we had to witness to every week. And of course, the founder of the college, Tom Malone, he was a graduate of Bob Jones College back in the 1920s. And, and so that's where he learned a lot of his methodologies. And, a lot of students lied. I mean, look, I went to college full time, worked a 40-hour-a-week job, went to church 3 times a week, worked in the bus ministry, taught Sunday school, preached Sunday afternoons, and had a girlfriend. There was no time for saving sinners. There just wasn't, and so I tried, and I'd go out on visitation and things like that. But, I by all standards, I was a failure in that regard.
I'll just add one more thing to that, and then we'll move to the next topic. I felt very similarly when there was a Billy Graham crusade. I'm from Philadelphia, and somewhere around my college era, or right before it, there was a big Billy Graham crusade, and of course they get all the churches kind of rally like 6 months before it happens, and so we had meeting after meeting after meeting, both in our church and with other groups, and trying to get people ready, saying, we want you to really be ready to, help people who are going to come down at the end of these crusades and give their lives to Christ on the, in the field. And boy, that was such a big deal. And I remember being so excited, thinking, this is going to be it. I really am just going to see the fruit of the ability to share the gospel. And with all the preparation for months, there was only one person that I got to speak with, or one couple. And I could tell they were doing it for the show. They just wanted to come down, but when it was time for me to share the gospel with them, they were not even really listening. They were just looking at all the bright lights and stuff. Let me spend. I'm now 100 feet from Billy Graham, but I felt the same pressure. But looking back, I really do wish I could go back to everybody that I talked to and apologize. And I've done it to people that I've been able to connect with, but there's some people that I just we parted ways and so forth years ago. But I really do wish I could go back to everybody and tell them like what I know now and say, I'm really sorry, especially thinking that they're potentially now at the age where they're having kids and teaching their kids based on some of the things that I did. And thankfully didn't waste my whole life, and same with you, that, you got out and you made some things right. But for the years that we did spend in it, it's definitely a heartbreak to think that what I did and what it could be doing to generations, there's the seeds of this mythology.
Yeah. And certainly I have had opportunity to talk to and apologize to former church members for, members for things that I said and things that I did. And particularly, I'm thinking of, we had a Christian school in Southeast Ohio, and 3 of the students, later in adult life came out as gay. And I profusely apologized to them, because I'm thinking about those poor kids, and and they were, 2 of them were teenage years, and here's their preacher up there, railing against the sodomites, and whatnot. And I'm sure by the time they were teenagers, they probably had a good idea that they were gay, and how harmful that must have been to them, to hear someone that they loved and respected and just disparaging, who and what they were. And so I've had opportunity to apologize for that and make amends, and actually develop some good friendships with them. So
that's awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
One other question then before the college story. Shame. We're talking about your teenage years there right before college. How did you get through the college or teenage years with, obviously becoming sexually aware? We all get that message, that every man's going to accidentally look once, but it's second look that's the one that gets you. Don't look twice. And we all know we didn't look twice. We looked 3 or 4 times when we knew we weren't going to get caught. How did you deal with the shame of becoming sexual in the context of an ultra restrictive and if your groups were at anything like mine, very, very shame based. How did you deal with all that?
Well, yeah, I turned to prayer and repentance, because particularly I'm thinking that when I was 18, I guess, I had my first really serious relationship with a woman, and she was a couple years older than me. Much more sexual experience than I had, and we'd go out for drives in the Arizona desert, and look at the stars, and we had a wonderful relationship. But we kind of really pushed the envelope, and didn't cross the line. But boy, I look back on it now, it's like playing with a loaded gun, literally. And I'd come home, and and I'd be still sexually aroused, from being out with my girlfriend for the night, and and then I'd have to spend time in prayer, getting right with God, and I had the same issue with with Polly, because we were, we dated for 2 years before we got married, and we were in a climate at the college where we weren't allowed to touch each other, and we spent most of our time in college, breaking the rules. You found out which couples you could double date with, and then you could kiss and hold hands and put your arms around each other. But there was a lot of guilt associated with that. Not only guilt, but fear. Oh my God, if we get caught, they will kick you out of school for doing this. That was one rule that you did not break. And I can tell one story of that you might find amusing is my freshman year, I played on the college basketball team for a little bit, and don't make too much into that, because the college basketball team was like an intramural group, but we were practicing one night, and I went to slap a basketball, and I dislocated my finger badly. Had to go to the emergency room and get it reset, and so we had to wear a tie and to go for classes, and well, I couldn't tie a tie, and so I'd come out into the lobby area, and Polly would tie my tie for me, and well, that was breaking the 6-inch rule. She wasn't allowed to do that. And so somebody, some Pharisee, turned us in to the disciplinary committee, and we had to go before the committee, and I still remember this day, the one preacher, and he tried to make out her tying my tie as being something sexual, and he doesn't like the fact that I mentioned that story, and I mentioned him by name on my blog, by the way. So he prefers not to. But you should have treated me better, buddy. And and we got 50 demerits for that, and 75 demerits, and you're out of school. And and it was all over tying a tie, and it was so silly. And
That's crazy.
so there was a lot of fear, a lot of guilt, but I tell people this, it's kind of, we were fine for the first few months, and then Polly went home for Christmas, and I went down to visit her, and and we were allowed actually to be intimate for the first time and kiss and whatnot. And I use the analogy, it says, once you go to a Dairy Queen and buy a shake, after you've done that for the first time, every time you drive by the Dairy Queen, you want to buy another shake. And so it was kind of hard after those first experiences to go back to 6-inch rules and all those things. And so you just learn to cheat and find people that had similar willingness, to break the rules. And most students broke the rules in that regard. There were a few that were, they were on the straight and narrow until the day they said, I do. But yes.
That's crazy. Well, take us back to your college, or then I appreciate you entertaining my extra questions there for your
Sure.
pre-college time. But what happened next in the story, and with your journey there? And at this point, you and your wife are at the college together, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Polly started school 6 months before I did. She went to Oakland Christian College, Christian school there in Pontiac, and she graduated second in her class. And so her last semester of high school, she also took college classes, and so she was a little bit ahead of me. And so we met. I planned on. When I got to college, I saw it as, oh, this is a golden opportunity to date lots of girls, and I had a very active dating life as a high schooler. And so I got to college, and, I dated one girl, and that lasted a couple of weeks. And then I met Polly, and that was it. We were, she was it. She was the one. Yes. And, we just hit it off, and 5 months later, I proposed to her, and a year and a half after that, we got married. And so,
was she as confident about you as you were about her right away, or did she?
Oh yeah, she was. Now, I was her first and only boyfriend.
Okay.
So she didn't have anything to judge me by. I was it. Her mother, on the other hand, did not like me. Did everything in her power to break up our relationship, even to the point of, in the February before the July when we got married. So in 1978, she just flat told Polly that she couldn't get married. And it's the first time I ever, saw Polly stand up to her mom, and she told her that, we were going to get married with or without their blessing. And, when Mom finally realized that we were going to get married, one way or another, and then she kind of got with the program, and but yeah, we've been married 43 years, and I like to think that we hit it right, while we're at Midwestern. We were naive. We knew very little about life. And that's why, 6 weeks after we were married, Polly got pregnant. We had no training in birth control. And it was evident because, she got pregnant quickly. And so we were naive about finances. We were just about life in general. We just had no real world experience, and that crippled us maritally, and for quite a few years, until we grew up and matured. And I tell people, I says, yeah, it took us a few years to figure out that you have to pay the light bill to keep the lights on. It took us a little bit to learn that lesson, and but we learned, and so very naive. And
I was going to add with getting pregnant quickly, for a lot of groups, would you agree that a lot of Christian groups, that's almost the goal, right? I mean, if both the Duggar kind of groups and I know other groups that I've been associated with, if you can get pregnant on your wedding night, that's, be fruitful and multiply. Did you have that pressure in any sense?
Well, not to that degree, but certainly Polly, look, her whole objective of going to Midwestern was to marry a preacher. I mean, she'll tell you that it wasn't to get an education. It was, she wanted to be a preacher's wife, and her goal was to find a preacher to marry, and I happened to be it. And so.
And her dad had been a preacher, right?
Yeah, yes, her dad came at it later in life, but he's also a graduate of Midwestern, and Polly's uncle, who was until he died pretty much the patriarch of the family, he also graduated from Midwestern in the 1960s, was one of the college trustees for a number of years. And but we wanted to wait a year, of course. That was our goal. And but unfortunately, biology. So, yep. And we may do. And
the hard road, but I'm sure you all did a great job with what you could.
Yeah.
At that point, you were at school to become a pastor. So was that what your degree was in?
Well, we left before I graduated. I was 1 year short of my degree. Polly was 6 months away from her degree, and Polly was pregnant, couldn't work, and I got laid off. I was working in a machine shop full time in the evenings, and got laid off from my job. And it was kind of just this confluence of events, and so we decided that we were going to drop out of college, and we got all kind of grief, about that we just needed to trust God, and that God would provide, and all these things. And the bottom line is we had rent to pay and all these various things. And so we packed up our meager belongings, and we moved back to Northwest Ohio here. And I took a job working first for General Tire, and then I worked at a machine shop again. And but we only had moved back here for a month, and a local IFB church offered me a position as an assistant pastor. And so there was no going back to college at that point, So
did you feel like God was opening up those doors? Like, was there a lot of peace about that?
Yeah, there was, but I did feel like that was unfinished business in my life for a long time. It did help a little bit that I was at a conference in the 1980s, and the president of the college was there, speaking that night. And the college was really big on, don't be a quitter. God never uses quitters. And I was at that time pastoring a relatively successful country church, and he did, call me out by name, during the service, and said, well, if Bruce had stayed in college, we probably would have ruined him, And so I took that as a little bit of a concession from him that, no, I didn't finish college, but yes, I did okay anyways. But, in retrospect, I wish I had finished, I think, but, as with everything in life, sometimes you get these little curves in life, and you just follow the path that's before you. So
Yeah. It's funny with you
Polly
mentioning, I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
with you mentioning the preacher calling you out. I'll never forget it. Bob Jones, they have this huge amphitheater, thousands of students all sitting there for chapel every day. We'd go every 4 days a week. And I think the fifth day might've been something different, but at least 4 days a week we're in chapel. And so you're sitting there and you have your assigned seat, and everything. And they're very careful to make sure that you attended and didn't skip it. So you have to check in. But anyway, so thousands and thousands of students all there for, 45 minutes or whatever to listen to the preacher, often Dr. Bob, at that point, the older Dr. Bob was still alive and his younger son was doing a lot of preaching, but the younger one, who was maybe in his, I'm just going to guess, his late 40s at the time, he's preaching, and this one of the students is like nodding off, like he's sleeping. And you can easily imagine some of these kids, like you mentioned, you were working hard, you're doing all these things. It's easy to imagine a college student being really exhausted. And so this one college student was nodding off in chapel, and Dr. Bob made this guy stand up. He's like, son, you do not disrespect a preacher. You stand up. And he made this guy stand up for another 30 minutes in front of 4,000 or 5,000 students just to make him feel bad and make a point. And I felt so bad for this guy. Yes. I mean, and when he did it, when he like zoned in on this guy, I felt like you could hear a pin drop, and the, thousands of people all like, what just happened? And it was like he was giving this, student a reprimand one-on-one, but never forget that.
Yeah, I know Dr. Malone was that way. He'd call people out in a heartbeat about stuff. And in the auditorium, which I don't remember how many people it sat, there were about 5,000 people that went there when we were at Midwestern, but I don't think it sat that was with all their ministries and whatnot. But it was a Quonset building, and there was these pillars that held up the roof in all these different places throughout the building. And some students would deliberately find those pillars, and they would sit smack dab in back of them because they fall asleep. and Dr. Malone couldn't see them, of course, behind those pillars. And so it was, yes. I got to admit that I had more than one sleep time during church. I just so tired, and
yeah. I did want to ask too, I've got some notes here from your other podcast. I want to make sure I gave you a chance to talk about some of the stuff that was happening behind the scenes. I know some of this might have been before college, but some of it may be behind the scenes with your family. There were some issues with your dad and your mom. Can you, as you're kind of wrapping up the college time, can you tell us, where did the family issues with your parents fit in? What was happening at that time?
Well, the family problems span much of my life, and my mom was mentally ill, and she was a brilliant woman, but prone to fits of manic rage, and spent time in state mental hospital several times, was a prescription pill addict, repeatedly tried to kill herself. And I wrote a blog post recently about trauma, and that, in a short period of time, my mom, tried to drive her car in front of a truck, and she survived that. She overdosed on pills and had to be rushed to the hospital and have her stomach, pumped out. And, and then when I was 11, for example, I came home from school one day and she had slit her wrists, and she was lying on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. And, it was, so it was a long, the trauma and the family problems, it was just pretty much present in my life. And from that, my parents, they divorced when I was 15, and dad remarried quickly, married a 19-year-old girl with a baby. My mom quickly remarried, and she married her first cousin who had just got out of prison from robbery, and he was also a drug addict. And so there was a lot of turmoil family-wise, and so you throw all that in into this, moving all the time, and the schools, going to different schools, and I was very close to my mom, but I didn't have any meaningful relationship with my father. And now I found out 2 years ago the reason for that is that he was not my biological father. And actually, my mom had a fling as a 17-year-old girl, had a fling with a truck driver, and he was my father. And I found that out through a DNA test. And so my dad was always distant, not involved in my life. I don't remember a time where he attended one of my sporting events. And so, never a time where dad would ever have said, I love you, or anything like that. And it doesn't mean we had an acrimonious relationship. We just was indifferent, and so my mom at the age of 54, she killed herself. She eventually succeeded. And and that emotionally, it was very, very difficult for me. And but when my dad died, he died at age 49 from a heart attack, a stroke actually. And I was kind of indifferent about it. I didn't know how to feel. I miss him, as you would a family member, I guess, but not like I did, my mom. I look at my grandkids and my children, most of the, none of my grandkids, and only 2 of my children knew my mother. And I think what a good grandmother and great grandmother she would have been if given the opportunity, even with all her problems. So
can I ask about that in a little different sense?
Sure.
When you deconvert, obviously there's some specific reasons people deconvert, whether they are looking at the issue of incredible suffering in the world, or they're looking at biblical contradictions, or looking at mythology, whatever. But people have different reasons that they deconvert, and then they deconvert, and they look at those issues as that those are the things that caused me to say I just can't believe this anymore. But once you do that, often what happens is over time you go back and you say, I'll bet there was something earlier. I bet there were seeds, and that was the final crux of the matter that brought it to a head. But there were probably seeds that happened much earlier. When you described your situation with your parents, I can't help but wonder if that was in any way something that you would describe for yourself as a seed, in the sense of just like if you were a young boy saying your prayers at night, God, please make our family healthy, we want to thrive, or whatever words you would have used at that age. But God, my mom is struggling, please help her. And to see it literally like crumbling, like ashes, like a burnt piece of paper that's just ashes now, see it crumbling through your hands, and say, everything that God, I see in your word, you want families to be strong, to be a cornerstone, and in the church and the nation. And here I am in this family where we want to honor you, and it's just falling to pieces left and right. Like, God, where are you? Did that ever seem like an early seed to you, or do you think that was not like was that a separate category?
No. I think that I certainly had questions about that. I wondered why things were the way they were, and if God was this ever-present reality, why all of these things? Now, I was able to explain that by saying, well, God tests us, God tries us, and these things are meant for my good. Even though I look at it, I says, I look back on how could any of this have been good for a boy, any of it, and the fact, yes, I survived, but not without a lot of deep and lasting scars from all of that. So, I would think, I would agree that there was some trying to understand how that all worked, because I looked at families in the church, and they seemed that, their families were nice families, and look how wonderful parents they were, and all these things. And of course, I learned as a pastor that that's all a facade. Okay, I've had hundreds of couples sit across the desk from me, and things are not as they seem, and all sorts of difficulties and problems and secrets, and but yeah.
Can I ask you this way? When you we know that God isn't real, but at the time when you did think he was real, were you angry at God?
No, I would say I would. Tim, I've always, and I suspect my experience in life have made me this way. I'm just very stoic about life. Even now, with all the health problems I have, I'm just kind of matter of fact about it. It's just, it is what it is. What are you going to do about it? And I know with Polly, I always, she, in my eyes, she had such a good life, with her mom and dad, and her dad had a nice, he worked for the railroad, and they had a nice home, and drove a new car every 2 years, and went on vacation once, twice a year. And, but over time, I've learned that things are not as they seem there either, and so, I've talked to my children, about the things that they've experienced, growing up in our home, and were less than ideal. And they too, most of them, not all of them, but particularly my older children, pretty stoic themselves. You talk about our children tend to follow in our steps. They're kind of stoic about life too. They don't hold it against me. And we've had many a discussion about the past, and so that's, it's just my personality. I just, if we were sitting here and the roof started falling down on us while I'm talking, I would say, oh shit. And, okay, now what do we do? Yeah. I've just never been one to, get emotionally wild about things in my life. And I know my oldest son's ex-wife, I used to drive her crazy, and she drove me crazy. And she was what I call a clap happy seal. And so and she just could not wrap her mind around the fact that I was just so stoic about life, and that if she'd ask me a question, I'd say, that's nice, that's fine, or whatnot. And she just expected me to become this happy, exuberant person, and that's just not who I am. And nor was her husband, my son. And, and so sometimes we would conflict over that, until I, finally impressed upon her, look, I am who I am, and for a lot of different reasons. Doesn't mean I don't have passion, doesn't mean I don't care. I deeply love, and I'm never going to be the grandfather who stands in the back row of the gymnasium shouting when my grandkids, playing in the band or playing basketball or whatever, but doesn't mean that I don't care about what they're doing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we all show our passion and love different ways. Sounds like you got a lot of good, really strong inner fortitude, which is it's a great thing to get you through the storms of life. That's awesome.
Yep.
I know we're inching towards your deconversion. I don't want to take us too far off track from that. But I did just want to ask maybe one or two more questions, and then you can take us into the main point of this, which is about your deconversion. But
Okay.
when you were a pastor, um, what was your bread and butter as a pastor? Were you preaching more fire and brimstone? Were you preaching more of the love and the grace of God? Like, what was if someone had been under your, pastorate and had said, you know, they were there to describe you. What is this pastor like? What would they have said? And just what were your typical sermons like?
Well, I look at it. There's the first. So if we go back to the 70s until probably the early 80s, mid 80s, I was typically a topical or a textual preacher. Yeah, pretty much fire and brimstone, sermons. And
And you preached a
but in
literal
the
hellfire, right?
oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And preaching against sin and because you can't be a good Baptist preacher if you don't preach against sin. And in the mid 1980s, my preaching evolved, and I started preaching expositionally, and so instead of taking a text and preaching on it, or a topic and finding Bible verses to support the topic, I started preaching through books of the Bible, for example. And my preaching fundamentally changed then. I became more concerned about what the text said, how we could apply it in our lives. And I still had a lot of passion in my preaching. I was very emotive when I preached. And it depends on what point, I guess, then in the ministry, somebody was under my preaching, what they would say about my preaching. Now, I would still preach hellfire and brimstone as an expositional preacher if it came up in the text. Right. I didn't chase rabbits. So for example, I preached through the book of John, for example, and I preached 121 sermons from the book of John. It basically took me a couple years to preach through the book, and so I was very methodical. I took my craft seriously. I spent hours each week preparing my sermons, and I really didn't have much use for what I called lazy preachers who would, I had one preacher, Dennis Coral was his name. He was an evangelist, and he told me that I was spending too much time studying, and that I just needed to get out there and win souls. And that, he says, well, I don't spend more than a few hours every week, preparing my sermons. And I thought, yeah, it shows. And I just couldn't do that, and so as a pastor, I believed I had a responsibility to teach, the truth as I understood it. And I wanted to do that well. And so that's the kind of preacher I was. And over time, as I, age, we all get older, I did mellow out. I wasn't quite as physically active in the pulpit as I was in my younger years. So
pounding it with your fists.
yeah, the hand raising and all of the, I could, as a younger preacher, I walked around quite a bit, or I might even come down out of the pulpit, down onto the, the floor, closer to where the congregation was. And, but as I got older, that some of that changed, I became more mature, I guess.
Just for clarification, were you a King James only preacher? I assume with being from the Baptist persuasion.
Yeah, I was King James only so my entire upbringing until early 2000s probably. And so for quite a few years. And then for a little bit, I started using the New American Standard, and then went to the English Standard Version of the Bible, which is very much a Calvinistic text. And then surprisingly, I late in the ministry, I not preaching from it, but in devotionally, I started reading the Message, and honestly, that was one of the most delightful translations that I ever read. It really spoke to me, because it was so readable, and but from the pulpit for the latter years, I used the ESV, and so yeah, but I remember making the switch from being King James only. That was, some of my friends thought I was falling off the deep end, because there was only one Bible, and it was 1611 KJV.
That's right. Well, that's a slippery slope coming in again. I remember too, one of the funniest things I remember from my time as a Christian is how there were certain men who would get up in church service and with the pastor would maybe do the prayer or something, and read scripture. But there were some gentlemen who, when they would pray, even though when they would speak, they would not speak in King James only-ish. The minute that they start praying, it's King James only.
Oh yeah.
And very, the deep voice comes out, thou, Lord, art amazing. And I was like, why can't you talk normal? Like, if you never say that.
That's right. Yes.
But it's like somehow like as if God speaks King James only English. It's really crazy.
Yes.
Anyway, well, heading towards your deconversion, before you jump into it, which one of you started the deconversion first, do you think?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
You did?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, though Polly was certainly, I tell people she was in the same zip code with me when, we started talking about these things. And
so she wasn't scared as you started to talk about the issues?
No, I think she was tired. I think she was discouraged. And so this was a time where we could honestly talk about the Bible and talk about what we believed, and
That's
and
awesome.
So yeah, and we spent countless hours laying in bed, at night, and we'd talk about these issues. Or we might have one of Bart Ehrman's books, for example, and I'd read something from it, and then we'd talk about it. And
kudos
so,
to you
yeah,
for doing it, to being able to talk, because a lot of people, that's you start talking about even contemplating the idea that this isn't the word of God, and I mean sparks fly with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I commend you highly for being able to do it together. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and I wrote a post years ago. It says, count the cost before you say you're an atheist, because once you utter those words, you don't control what happens next. And so I'll get people to write me, and they'll say, well, I'm an atheist, but my wife is still a believer. What do I do? And I said, well, you need to tread carefully, because some marriages don't survive. They just don't. And if you force a spouse to choose between you and Jesus, some of them are going to choose Jesus. And I have some people that I've met over the years that, when they deconverted, they're primarily it's their wives, they left them, said, nope, I can't do this with you. And then I have other people I know that have, they have found ways to make that work in a mixed marriage. Now, if I'm giving counsel and advice to people, I tell them it's probably best to avoid a mixed marriage, because it's hard. For an atheist and an evangelical, for example, their worldviews are so different, and
I live that every day. That's exactly my situation. So I know exactly what you mean.
Yes. And I remember a few years back, I ran into a woman that I was her pastor for a number of years, and her husband's an atheist, and and she's a devout Christian. And I asked her, I says, if you had to do all over again, would you marry your husband? And she just flat told me, she said, no. I wouldn't, because there's a big part of my life that I can't share with him because he's not interested in it. And he would go to church with her and things like that. And that's how we became friends. I was a pastor at the time. But she thought that their marriage was diminished because they didn't have these common experiences with each other.
Yeah, it's I'll save my story for another day, but just to ditto that, it's a hard journey, very hard journey, and I like the way you put it, to count the cost, because and I get the same kind of emails where people say, "What should I do?" And there are some people where you can tell from what they say and what, reading between the lines, that like, if you speak up, it sounds from what you're saying like you're gonna hit the fan hard, and you're gonna lose some people very quickly. So maybe it's not time. And I've even said that, like, where I encourage other atheists to please speak up. I'm like, but I encourage you to speak up if it's the right time and the right scenario.
Right.
For some of you, it's time to just sit back. And there's some good reasons though to do that too, just to use that time to get grounded. And specifically, I tell people, if you're sitting back and it's not time yet, use that time to really learn where the mythology came from. Whether you're talking about things like digging deep into the book of Enoch and how the New Testament quotes it over 150 times, or how the Homeric epics and the Iliad and the Odyssey and Euripides' Bacchae, how those get quoted dozens of times in the New Testament and the Gospels. Figure it out, get grounded, so that when the time comes and they say, "Oh, so you left. Why did you leave?" That you've got a gazillion questions, and you're ready to go. Comparative mythology and the Greco-Roman mystery cults, all that stuff. Like, learn it in depth. And for anyone that doesn't know what I'm talking about, I'll put some links beneath our video. But other YouTube channels such as Myth Vision, Gnostic Informant, Dragons in Genesis, they interview scholars all the time and talk about these issues. Where did the mythology come from? So anyway, it's a side note, but just wanted to plug those channels and talk about what I tell people.
Yeah, and I have several long time readers that they go to church every Sunday with their believing spouse, and they do it for the sake of their marriage and for their children. And I don't judge them for that, and I don't think I could do that, but I respect the fact that they're willing to set aside to some degree their beliefs or their lack of belief, to be at peace with their spouse. And for every couple, it's different, and it's just wise to counsel people, just tread slowly, because trust me, when you say, "Hey, honey, I'm an atheist," you don't know what's going to happen next.
I remember even just saying the words, it was something very similar to this. I don't know where this is leading me. This was maybe a year before my deconversion, but saying, I don't know where this is leading me, but I'm doing a lot of research, and I'm just going to put this out there. I'm more committed to the truth than to what I currently believe. And if the truth and what I currently believe match, great. If they don't, I'm going to take the truth where it leads me. And even that was like horrifying. Yes. And it is. I think too, it helps, if we can, to some extent, to put ourselves back in their shoes, to realize, but you got married, both not your friend's story, but in many cases you got married, both committing, before the pastor and the church and that wedding, to commit your lives to Christ, to commit your children to the Lord and to the kingdom. And like, you've now departed, and it's like, if the roles were reversed, it would feel very shocking, and it helps to kind of put ourselves in their shoes.
Absolutely. And because really, they feel, they can feel like they've been sold a false bill of goods, that, hey, this is what I married, and now you're this. And I encourage people to look, be patient, do lots of talking, do not get into arguments about this. They just don't turn out well. And sometimes, when someone deconverts, it exacerbates other problems that are already in the marriage, and those kind of come to the forefront too. And I wish I could tell people that it always has a happy ending, but it just doesn't. It just doesn't.
Well, I appreciate your wisdom on that. I do want to make sure then we maybe head to the punchline of the interview. Why,
Okay.
knowing, let me phrase it maybe dramatically, knowing that the Bible is the word of God and that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, knowing that what's at stake is the fires of hell for all eternity, knowing what Christ did in his death and resurrection, and that the only way to have your sins forgiven is through the sacrifice of perfect spotless lamb, and that his blood has the power, the only power to cleanse you. Why in the world did you leave? You had everything.
Well,
You had the golden ticket.
yes, I did.
You were on the train to heaven. The banks of Jordan were in your sights.
Yes. And of course, I was 50 years old when I deconverted. My counselor told me that, that it is very rare for people my age to deconvert, especially pastors. There's too many sunk costs, and that old gospel song, I've come too far to turn back now. And but for me personally, it was I started looking at the Bible itself, and as you know, with evangelicals, the foundation of their beliefs, their whole worldview is the Word of God. That it's not only is it inspired, which is a faith claim, but also that it's inerrant and it's infallible. And so what happened is for me is that I started reading books outside of my evangelical rut, and I came to the conclusion that no, the Bible's not inerrant, it's not infallible, and then I started reading Bart Ehrman's books, and those were such an eye-opener to me and to my wife Polly, that basically most of what we had been taught in college and most of what we were taught in churches as teenagers and young adults, most of what we had been taught simply was not true. And so that kind of kicked the door open for us. And for me personally, that, okay, the Bible's not inerrant, it's not infallible, it's internally inconsistent. There are mistakes, there's errors, there's contradictions, there's and now what? And so for me, I started looking at, okay, what is it that I really believe? And so I started looking at the various central claims of Christianity, the resurrection, the virgin birth, and basically these supernatural things. And I came to the conclusion that I just no longer could rationally believe those things to be true. And and so at that moment, my house kind of came tumbling down, and
would you call it a season, or was there like a specific day that it all happened? Or?
No, it was over time, but it culminated with the fact, of us, of me finally saying, look, I am not in a meaningful way any longer a Christian. If I don't believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead, if I don't believe in his virgin birth, I don't, believe these various things, then how can I meaningfully be a Christian? Now, I have lunch or dinner once a month with United Church of Christ pastor and a Lutheran pastor, and great guys. And and the United Church of Christ pastor is very liberal. Started out as a Roman Catholic, and later in life, entered seminary and whatnot. And I've asked myself that question: that if I had started on his path instead of mine, would I have ended up in the same place? And I don't know, maybe
like
my
if you would have stayed liberal, just this
yeah.
Christian.
And if I had stayed, yes, yeah, because his views are quite liberal. And,
Yeah.
sometimes I kind of shake my head and I say, wow, my evangelical mind kicks in and I says, so, when he explained what he believed about the resurrection, for example, and things like that. And,
Is it more of a
but
Gnostic and kind of a Gnostic interpretation, or?
well, more of it was a spiritual event, and he's more interested in what the story of the resurrection tells us
Yeah.
than it being an actual historical event.
Almost like
And
like a parable. What should I learn? What's
yeah,
my life
yes,
lesson?
yes, yes. And but for me, unfortunately, that's not the path that I took. And so, as Dr. Ehrman would say, that it was a big fall for him too, as an evangelical, when he realized that all these things that he had been taught simply were not true. And so your whole house comes tumbling down, and then that allowed me then to wrestle with other things like, the problem of evil, the problem of, these classic, problems with Christianity, the problem of evil and problem of suffering. And particularly the problem of suffering was a big issue for me. And in fact, actually, I talk about Dr. Ehrman's books. It was actually his book on suffering that was the most influential book for me. And because he asked a lot of the questions that just troubled me, about the world as it is. If there's a God, why is there so much suffering? And not only human suffering, but in the animal world, animals who have no free will, animals who have, they haven't sinned, they just exist. And yet there's just untold, suffering. And and I couldn't reconcile those things, with the fact that there was a God. And so you take all that together, I just came to believe that there wasn't a God.
When you were starting to move toward there, but not yet there, but as you're like kind of maybe asking that question in the back of your mind and slowly pushing it to the front, did it ever cross your mind, the whole fear factor of maybe a couple fear factors? Number one, I am in danger of being basically a non-believer, and if the hellfire that I believed in was correct, that I'm in danger of a eternal punishment. But then, of course, even if that weren't true, just the fear of what if I'm blaspheming? What if this God is real? What if Yahweh is real and I've just blasphemed him, effectively committing, whether it's the unpardonable sin or it's an unpardonable sin? If you don't confess Christ as Lord, you're not saved. And
Right.
did you, in that frame of mind, did you ever fear that this was the devil tempting you to just trying to pull you away?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I struggled with that, even after I reached the place where I says, look, I'm no longer a believer. I struggled, in that you're in the still of the night, you're laying in bed, and that thoughts about, well, what if you're wrong, and the fear of hell and fear of judgment. And but I finally reached a place where, look, I says, God knows where I am. God has my text number and my email address. He could easily clear this problem up for me. And all these years later, I have not heard one word from him. And and so I had a
Good way to put
lady
it.
on my blog. She's kind of in the deconversion process, but she still wants to hang on. And she said she wished that she could have the assurance or the confidence that I have, and well, I didn't always have that. I remember a guy an atheist telling me, early on in the deconversion process, that he says, look, he says, it will get better with time. And he was right. It did. And um, you know, in my wife's case, you know, though some of the intellectual reasons were the same, Polly's deconversion had a much bigger emotional component than mine did. And, we've even now we still talk about that, how her experiences in church and which were so different from mine, deeply affected her. And this, the fact that God seemed to be nowhere to be found. And look, God knows where we are now, yet he chooses not to speak to us. What would be a greater feather in the cap if we became Christians, and repented of our atheism, but God is silent, so either we're predestined to hell, or we've, like you said, we've committed the unpardonable sin, we've crossed that line of no return, or maybe there is no God, and I'm confident that when it comes to Christianity anyways, and certainly the extant gods that humans have created, I'm confident that there's no God. So
Yeah. Would you say for your wife that her time in Christianity was in some ways traumatic? Like, would she say that there was religious trauma that she had to heal from?
yes. And I think that for her, look, I was the center of attention. I was the hub around which everything turned. And, when I stood at the back of the church on Sundays, and everybody shook my hand and told me what a wonderful preacher I was and how great my sermon was. And, I was the center of attention. Well, Polly, she didn't have those experiences. She was kind of an appendage. She, played the piano, or she was, when nobody would show up for nursery, she had to work in the nursery, and she was her husband's gopher, secretary. And so her experiences were, to a large degree, were negative, or not very fulfilling, might be the better word. And so, I've on occasion I said, hey, they're having so and so, over here at this church. I think I'd like to go over and hear that guy speak. And she gives me that look that says, buddy, no chance. And she absolutely wants nothing to do with it whatsoever. And so in many ways, she's more set in her ways about unbelief than I am. And and I think that to a large degree is some of the experiences that she had in church. And look, she had some people just treat her awful, and she was so quiet and meek, and a good woman in every sense of the word. And there were some people that treated her poorly. And I don't want to paint a picture where it sounds like, well, she just had a bad experience and now she doesn't believe anymore. Right. But our experiences do play a part. For the longest time, I wouldn't admit that in my life. I wanted everyone to think that, well, I'm an atheist because of these intellectual reasons, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But over time, I realized that no, your deconversion has a lot of factors to it. And they have affect how we view the world, and certainly played a big part, in my deconversion. Weren't the primary reason. I didn't leave Christianity because somebody hurt me, or I was, upset with God, or I hated God, or all these various things. Primarily, it's for intellectual reasons, but there was an emotional component too.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's worth definitely at least trying to dig into what some of those earlier seeds might have been. And I know for me, the disillusionment of some earlier issues helped, where it was just like, for example, one of the biggest things that I was taught about, and it was focused for so many aspects of my Christian life was to find God's will. What is God's will? What is God leading you to? What doors is he opening? I remember even the older Dr. Bob Jones. I remember he was like a icon, an idol almost. And I remember one time it was some kind of evening event, and he was standing up on stage, and to actually talk to the older Dr. Bob, in his probably early 70s, to talk to the Dr. Bob would just be such a cool thing. And it was like I had this chance. Like I was like, if I don't do it now, I'll probably never get a chance to do it. And he's just standing up on stage after some events over, and I'm like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna walk up these stairs. Everyone's filing out. I'm gonna walk up and come up and ask him for his autograph. And he was very gracious, glad, and he wrote a little thing, and I read it as I was leaving, and it said, "Pursue the will of God to do it." And I probably still got the paper somewhere in my files, but like that was such a big motif, is pursue the will of God. And I remember there was a situation of a romantic situation where it hadn't worked out, and I was very disappointed. And then I saw what I thought was God opening up the doors for a different one. And I mean, it was just wonderful beyond wonderful. And that expression, to restore the years the locust has eaten.
Yeah.
I just thought this girl, she's restored the years the locusts have eaten. And I was like, this is God's will. God's doing great things in my life. He shut that door so we could open this one. And I sensed that what I thought was peace. And we dated for a year, and then we got engaged 6 months to the wedding, and 1 month left till the wedding occurs. And we're in the premarital counseling, as you do, and she tells the counselor, Tim treats me better than anyone I've ever been with, even my parents. Like, he treats me so good. I love it. And I was, sitting there and listening. I'm like, I'm proud. I'm glad she feels that way. So it's wonderful. That's the way you should start a marriage.
Yes, yes.
And we were, by the way, the context, we were in different locations. She was in Florida. I was in Atlanta, in Georgia. Long distance relationship. But we had a lot of trips, saw each other a lot. So anyway, 1 month to go before the wedding. And I'm just praising God. God, thank you so much. I feel the peace. I feel the open door. You've restored the years locusts have eaten. 1 month to the wedding, she says this to the premarital counselor. I'm thinking, we're golden. This is a great way to start. She flies home to Florida. I'm thinking we're planning the wedding. A week later, I come home from work to an email from her. It says, I'm immediately ending everything. Keep in mind, this is after 18 months. 18 months of glorious, better. Every day is better than the last. Email saying, I'm ending everything immediately. Do not bother calling. I will not answer. And I thought, what in the world? God's been opening these doors. What's happening? When she was going to marry me, she instead married someone else, which of course implies she was probably double dating of some sort. Yes. But I thought, like, God, what in the world? You had all this peace that you were giving me.
Right.
And it's like, that's not the reason I deconverted, but it might have been a seed to say, this just doesn't add up. If I've pursued God's will and his peace so much, why would he give me so much peace about something that's just going to blow up in my face? And there were a few other incidences that would fall in the category of that, like God, I felt you opening up the doors, and then it slammed in my face over and over and over in different contexts. And I thought, this just doesn't make sense. Like, what's the point of pursuing God's will if it just slams in your face every time?
Right. Yeah, I remember, as I told you earlier, I believing that God was telling me to, leave the church I was in, and we were going to move to Texas, and I just was certain that was my lifetime move. That was the one right there. And just so sure that God was in the midst of that. And 7 months later, I'm sitting back in Ohio, and it turned into the worst nightmare of my life. That the guy that I was a co-pastor with was just awful to work with, and had angry and temperamental, and it just turned. And I remember at the time, wondering, God, what's this all about? Because it didn't make sense to me. Why would you have me move 1,600 miles with my family and then turn around and just basically burn everything to the ground? And I still haven't found an answer to that question. But you mentioned several times in our discussion tonight about seeds, and I think about that a little bit, and that probably was one of those moments where I really wondered about this supposedly personal God that's intimately involved in our life. Yeah. Instead of it being, you should have investigated this pastor and this church more closely. You made a bad decision. And, and it was just a hard lesson for me to learn, and an expensive lesson for me to learn. So,
for sure. Well, I was just going to comment too on the idea of it being, the reasons for deconverting being part of our experience. But I will admit, for me, even though there were certainly many precursor backdrops to it, it definitely took the mythology, studying the mythology, and then, like you said, the discrepancies in the Bible, for me to actually do it, because I think I had it drilled into me so much that if like, I remember praying as a teenager when I read, for example, the book from Joni Eareckson Tada, who, if anyone doesn't know her, she as a young teenager, she had jumped into a very shallow pond or lake or something and snapped her neck, and she was a quadriplegic, so their whole body from her neck down doesn't work. And she basically used that as a way to say, God, I'm going to give my life, broken as it is, I'm going to give it to you and shine, despite how broken my body is. And from her perspective, and a lot of Christians, she's certainly been, used by the Lord in great ways. Sure. But I remember when reading that and some other things by people like Watchman Nee and other great preachers and Charles Spurgeon and so forth, I remember praying a lot as a teenager, God, I want to leave my hands open to you, and I want more than anything to be holy. I want to be separate for you, and I want to be a useful vessel. And if you need to break me, whatever that means, if I need to become a quadriplegic, if I need to have everything that I dream of taken away from me, do what it takes. I don't want the world. I want Jesus. I don't want the world. I want the kingdom of God. And I want to have my eyes focused, turn your eyes upon Jesus. And I said, God, I want nothing else to be in between me and you. Everything else should be far on the periphery. And if you leave your hands open, and God said, God puts and gives, he takes away, gives, he takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And that, because of that mentality of being willing to be, sacrificed in every, gladly sacrificed for the sake of the gospel or God's will, what it took for me was, and I would say I should add to the context that God is king and he calls the shots. You don't question the king. And what it took for me was to really understand the actual mythology, to dive deep into the Greco-Roman mystery cults, into the sources for where they copied the stories from the New Testament from. Once I began to get into some of that, and the inerrancy issue, with the discrepancies in different passages, it literally was one of those moments of like, shoot, I can't unsee what I've seen. This doesn't. Yeah, right. And I remember thinking earlier, like before the deconversion, I remember thinking, this sounds like a really poorly done book, and thinking to myself, is this the best we've got? Like, the best we've got is all these discrepancies. God's not the author of confusion, but this leads to me to so many questions that don't make sense. And I remember, for me, it was to me about 2.5 years ago, literally right here at this desk. And I'd been studying for 2 years and grappling with these questions, not thinking, at least earlier, that it would ever lead to atheism. To me, atheism was beyond stupid. But eventually, again, about 2.5 years ago, sitting here, and I mean, it just floods in. And within an hour, probably less, I was fully out. And the whole question of like, well, did you fear hell anymore? I was like, it was almost like I was laughing, like, this is stupid. Like, none of this has ever been real. Not a minute of it's ever been real. And I didn't fear hell or anything for a millisecond. Once that hour was over, I was completely out. And I described it as like if someone straps you in front of a fire hydrant, and it just, all of a sudden, that cover comes off and it just flows and you get it. All the dominoes fall down, or the house of cards falls. And I did want to ask, before we wrap up, 2 questions.
Sure.
what is your personal sense of peace and fulfillment been in your heart? Can you contrast, your sense of well-being before and after deconversion?
Uh, that's a difficult question for me because, um, you know, uh, I say I gave the best years of my life to Jesus, you know, um, and in the late '90s, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and then 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with an incurable stomach disease called gastroparesis, uh, and I've got degenerative spinal disease, and so I live with a lot of chronic pain and suffering, uh, and and so the the quality of my life is, during the time that I'm an atheist, has physically has not been very good for me.
Yeah.
It's been a challenge. Just I woke up this morning, and I had had a really bad night, and my throat was a little raw, and I says, really, today I got, I have this interview to do, and I'm feeling like this, and I finally got up and got around and whatnot. And so, uh, you know, from the physical aspect of it, uh, boy, life is just a challenge for me compared to how it was when I was a Christian. But emotionally, uh, it's much different. And now, granted, I had a lot to unpack in my life, and so I've been seeing a counselor for years, a competent secular psychologist, and uh, to help me get a grasp of my past, and to find some sense of peace and wholeness in my life, and 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 so I generally I'm at peace with how life is. As I told you before, I tend to be quite stoic about life, but I'm happy. Love my kids, love my grandkids. I do sense that my time is running out. So I've been working on a bucket list. So, it's kind of, I realize that, you know, things could take a turn for me sooner than later. And so there's things I want to do. So, like, for example, we're going to a minor league baseball game tomorrow. Next Tuesday, we're going to a Breaking Benjamin concert, which try to understand that in the context of coming from my background, going to a Breaking Benjamin concert, and then, we're going to take a vacation, and I haven't been on one for years physically, but I want to do that with Polly and our oldest daughter, who's still here at home. And then after that, we're going to a Hailstorm concert. And so, there's these things I want to do, why I can do them. And because I don't want the last years of my life that the only memory that people have of me is somebody that was disabled, somebody that was sick, somebody that was, had to get around in a wheelchair, or, walking with a cane all the time. So I'm trying to have more memorable experiences, because this is the only life that I have. And what I'm going to leave behind for my children and grandchildren with Polly is these experiences that we've had with each other. And so I'm trying to make them good ones. And I will say, Tim, that, if one thing atheism has improved for me and is my marriage. And Polly and I are closer today than we ever have been. And I tell people that, we always loved each other, but I'm not sure we were always friends with each other, and our friendship is developed. One thing about losing all your connections and friends, you have to spend time with, she and we didn't have anybody else to turn to, and so that's worked out well for us. And we've go out, financially, we're a lot better off than we were years ago. And so we're able to do a lot of different things. And so all in all, life is good. You know, doesn't
That's
mean that
awesome.
I'm always rah, 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 or anything like that, but
Right. That's beautiful. I love hearing that. It's a great perspective on all those topics. You did allude to my last question, which is how have people treated or mistreated you? Have you been shunned? Have you had any nastygrams? Like what's been the backlash been like for
oh, well,
both like with you? I don't just mean with your blog and your interviews, but just even your personal conversations with friends and family. Like, are people trying to
yeah.
attack you over this?
Yeah, I'm very active in writing. I write letters to the editor in the local newspapers, and so I get a lot of responses to those letters from evangelical Christians. And whether I write on religion or whether I write on politics, it doesn't matter, you know, and very hostile, very negative. And
Hmm.
I've had one guy stop at my house, you know, local guy, he was going to set me straight, you know, and which was a little scary, somebody showing up on your doorstep. And you know, and for the most part, you know, look, I don't know how it is where you live, but people here are polite, they're respectful for the most part. But I also know what people, you know, say behind the scenes too. And I know three of our one, two, three, four of our children, and then Polly also, who actually graduated from the community college out here, and as did three of our children. You know, there were challenges there because people know who I am, you know, and so I have a unique last name. I'm the only Bruce Garenser in the world. So they'll make that connection real quickly. So, hey, are you related to the guy that writes in the newspaper? Or, you know, and so there would be some problems with that, you know, and professors would even bring it up, you know, about whether they were related to me. And so, and I take all that with a grain of salt anymore. I didn't used to. When I first deconverted, boy, I took criticism personally and I found it hurtful. And I'd blog for a while and it'd get too much and I'd stop and I'd start and I'd stop. And then finally, about 7 or 8 years ago, I just, you know, finally psychologically got my mind wrapped around it to where I could successfully, you know, write and do the things that I do without, you know, letting the criticism and the attacks, you know, get to me. I've had death threats. I had a man threaten to rape my daughter. They've attacked my wife. You know, and more threats about the judgment and the hellfire than I could. And I'm sure you get those too. You know, where people just, if your objective is to win me back to Christianity, this is definitely the wrong approach, because who I wouldn't want to go to church with you at all. And so, but you know, I have one evangelical friend left locally. He and I have been friends for 55 years. So our friendship kind of debate, you know, goes back to our school days, and we just don't talk about religion or politics. You know, we choose to talk about other things, and it seems to work. And so, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, the challenges with family and whatnot, you know, have been, those aren't going to go away. We've just kind of made peace with that. It's just how it is. And
Do people ask you much why you left, like how I did? Do people say, I think I'm going to disagree with you, but I'm curious, why did you leave? Did people even ask you that question, or do they just not care?
yeah, was it? No, I'll yeah, that's a certainly a question I get fairly often. Less so now from locals and certainly from family, because the story's already been told. And so I mean, they know, you know, my reasons for leaving Christianity. And but I'll run into people that they'll find out I'm an atheist, and it's like this group I meet with to have dinner, and another gentleman joined us for dinner this last time, and he's as he has some form of spirituality. I don't think I have figured it out, and he was just having a hard time understanding how it's possible that somebody just didn't believe in God at all, and he asked a lot of questions, and he said some things that were kind of biting at times. But I said, hey, we're sitting over dinner here. It's, I'm not going to have an argument with somebody. And, and I took it as, hey, this is a guy who sincerely wants to know. And I do run into locals that don't know that I'm an atheist. And so one guy at the grocery store, for example, not long ago said, hey, Bruce, where are you preaching at these days?
Right.
And I can change that subject, quickly. And I,
Tell them free thought hall.
yes. Because there's no value in going into a long discussion in the middle of the grocery store with somebody about, why you're no longer a believer. And so
I will just piggyback off that just to say, I the one thing that really shocks me with all the people, when I think about all these people that could ask me, and honestly, people don't ask me why I left, which is also surprising. And actually, let me rabbit trail on that for 30 seconds. I've one of the biggest shocks to me was that almost nobody tried to win me back. Like it just, even some of the closest people. And I thought, if you really believe I'm going to burn in hell for what I'm doing, or what I'm not believing, don't you think I'm worth trying for? Sure. I was willing to go to the ends of the earth. I wanted to be a Bible translator in a jungle environment, to do Bible translation in jungle church, tribal evangelism. I was willing to go live my life in the jungles of New Guinea or of some country in Africa to win souls. And here I am, your family. You don't say anything about it. And I think there's probably an intimidation factor where they're like, look, we know what everything we could say. So what's the point?
Yeah, that's
but
right.
The thing that's interesting to me is when I think about all these people that, that are still stuck in it, and myself when I was stuck in it, it's just the profound lack of good information that you have as a Christian. And for me, like, there's even some facts about the Bible that I've discovered some Christians, pockets of them do know, and they just kind of change their Christianity. But it just, even the fact of knowing it is so important. I mentioned the Book of Enoch, which has become a big project for me. I'm cataloging every instance of the Book of Enoch in the New Testament, and so far I've got between 150 and 200 instances where it's referenced or quoted. And if someone said, for example, just there's at least 100 direct quotes of the Book of Enoch in the New Testament. I mean, I went to Bible college. I was in the Word of God every day, and under the pastor, everything. I knew my Bible back and forth. I was reading, listening to, Christian radio. Not a single Christian preacher, theologian, pastor, anybody ever said the Book of Enoch is quoted at least 100 times. I mean, I know about the one or two where it's like Jude and Second Peter or something, but there's a lot more than those. They never told me that, or about the whole thing of, how it quotes Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and Euripides' Bacchae dozens of times. And I think that's my biggest heart in all this, as I have a platform, obviously, and as I hope that some people do eventually ask me, why did you leave? I really hope Christians get this sense, like, just, if you still want to believe, fine, but do it with all the information out there, not this little sliver of narrowness and blinders on. Like, if you want to still believe, then fine. Because I do know some Christians that do it. They'll say, you're right, the Book of Enoch is quoted 100 times in the New Testament. That just means that Enoch should have been in the canon. They don't lose their faith. They just shift it with, wherever the winds go. But, you can still believe, but just have all the information if you're going to truly swing out, as it were, into eternity on this rope of the Bible. Know where your Bible came from, and know how church history evolved and how things changed. And like you said, Bart Ehrman's books, given the full picture of, there's not 4 gospels, there were like 60, and probably originally there were most likely hundreds of them. And there was not one book of Acts or 6 books of Acts. And there were many Christianities at first. And like, just tell people this information and then let them make up their mind, as opposed to giving them this very limited version. But anyway, I'm on a soapbox there, but you know what I'm saying. It's such a burden.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, you talk about, you take my wife's parents, for example. So we're 14 years since we left Christianity, and Polly's dad died 2 years ago. But they have yet to have a meaningful discussion with us about why we no longer believe. They're just content to pray for us, and and they just, and I think the reason is there's a fear, because they know that I know the Bible well. They know I have good reasons, for why I no longer believe, and they probably feel that they're just not capable of having that intellectual discussion with me. But you're so right. I look back at my life, and you take like Calvinism when I was in college. This is the amount of teaching I got on Calvinism in college. We are not Calvinists in this college. That's it. End of discussion. Right. And I never heard one word about it whatsoever. And so I was taught a very narrow, as I'm sure you were at Bob Jones, a very narrow view of Christianity, and a neatly packaged fundamentalist view of Christianity. And whereas I talked to my United Church of Christ pastor friend, well, he got a wealth of material and information when he was in seminary, that I had never heard of, and I agree with you that I'd have less of a problem with people being Christians if they just were believers after they knew all the facts, and but
well, I guess that's the point, though, is if we probably would agree that if they knew a lot of the facts, they probably wouldn't be Christians anymore, because it's just
it's right. Yes.
That's the clincher.
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth that probably the best cure for Christianity is probably a comparative religion class, yes. And because it exposes you to other religious views, but of course it didn't have those, so.
Yeah, or a very thorough early church history class.
Yes.
One of the things that's been shocking to me recently, on this note, we're mentioning it, the anti-Semitism. You see it in the Gospels. I'm looking at how Matthew does that, but just even the church fathers, some of the early church fathers were absolutely stunningly anti-Semitic. And even Martin Luther, Martin Luther, founder of Lutheranism, which played right into Nazi Germany. But, you look at Martin Luther was one of the most anti-Semitic people out there. And, he's all these bastion of faith. He's, 95 Theses. This is great. It's like, no. This is some nasty stuff. Anyway, I digress. I do want to get back to wrapping up with talking about you. Just want to say thank you for what you're doing, because you're vocal. You've got, you're going on different platforms and sharing your story. Stories matter. And I think yours is such a unique perspective. And I know there's a lot more topics we could probably get into at some point. Maybe we can do a follow-up, but
sure.
I just want to say, this is awesome what you're doing. And just the fact that you're using, whatever time you've got left, and, all of us using what time we've got left to say, let's leave this place better than we found it. And I just want to thank you so much for doing that. And I did want to also ask, was there any topics you wanted to mention before we wrap up that I didn't get to? You're welcome to take the floor if there's anything else.
No, I do appreciate the format of the interview. A lot of times when, I've done a lot of interviews in recent years, they tend to be really focused, and so I like that this has been much more wide ranging. So I can, you've asked me questions that I've not been asked before, and so that it was good. I did an interview earlier tonight before this one, and it was much more focused on my journey and whatnot. And I'm fine with that, but it's nice to talk about other things too, besides just this kind of narrow once I get the book written, I guess, I can stop doing the interviews. So,
Are you working on a book currently?
oh yeah, but I don't know if that's ever going to come to fruition. My editor keeps after me, but she realizes that my health makes it difficult. I have to choose, work on the book, write for my blog. I only have so much time every day to productively work. So,
yeah. Well, if you ever get it to the finish line, we'd love to. I'd love to have you back on and talk through that with you. That's awesome.
Well, anytime, Tim.
Yeah. Well, we've been speaking with Bruce Gerenser. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Close enough.
Bruce Gerenser. Bruce, thank you so much. I'll have a bunch of links beneath our video for his blog and some of his other interviews. Please go like and subscribe and all that, and follow him. Bruce, again, thank you so much. This has been great to get to know you. I definitely want to do it again, and keep doing what you're doing. We need your voice in the community.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yep.